Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Fantasy Gods, and the last one of the semester. My name's Brett Chaves, and with me, as always, is Ben Pope. Ben, now that spring has sprung in the sports world, and considering, this is the last episode of the semester, I think it's time we can finally start talking about some baseball.
Yeah, I like the little alliteration at the beginning there, Brett. Opening day, it's right around the corner, and it's really important to recognize, I think, some of the values here in fantasy baseball in your drafts, but not only in the drafts, but in the early weeks of trades and some of the free agent moves that you can make as well.
Yeah, 100%. So today we'll be going over our picks for the best players to begin your fantasy baseball season with. We'll be picking two players each, one hitter and one pitcher. Starting off with myself, moving over to the National League, it's Nick Castellanos from the Philadelphia Phillies. Man, this guy was a huge acquisition for Philadelphia this past offseason. There was some speculation whether or not the Phillies were actually going to acquire him, and then managed to sign him to a big-time deal. He's coming in with a pretty intense stat line from 2021, 309 average. He also batted just under 1,000 at OPS, and he's pretty much bringing the power that Philly was sort of lacking in their lineup, besides Bryce Harper. So it'll be him, Bryce Harper, and then the compliments of Didi Gregorius and company. And in fantasy baseball, I can't see why you wouldn't draft Nick Castellanos sort of in the middle rounds, beginning of your draft, and sort of act as like a complement to your 3-4 in your outfield. And just to put a bow on the cake here, Nick Castellanos, certainly an all-star potentially this upcoming season, and will definitely help in the early weeks in fantasy.
Yeah, definitely checks the boxes of average, home runs, and RBIs. And one of the concerns I had for him was originally, was he going to be able to move to a ballpark, or a team rather, that was going to be similar to what he was getting in Great American Ballpark with the Cincinnati Reds? And he honestly got perhaps even a better upgrade with Philly. Like you mentioned, Bryce Harper around him, Gene Segura and Kyle Schwarber has some great bats to surround him. So he should have a good lineup to surround him and put up some great numbers himself.
Yeah, for sure.
So I'll go over to my guy here, my outfielder. We both have outfielders here, ironically enough, and that's George Springer of the Toronto Blue Jays. I am a big fan of George Springer. As a Red Sox fan, I was really upset that he didn't sign with them a couple years back, but he's been a phenomenal player for the Blue Jays. In just over 300 at-bats, missing a bit of time with injury, had 22 home runs and put up over a 900 OPS. Phenomenal player when he did play, and he also had some really great at-bats at the Rogers Center once the Blue Jays made the transition back to Toronto right around July, August time. And what I think about Springer is the biggest thing for him, and why I value him so much here and have him as my mention, is that he's going to likely be taking over the leadoff spot in the Blue Jays lineup. That was held by Marcus Semien last season, and he was by far one of the most productive players in fantasy baseball, able to score a lot of runs with guys like Bo Bichette, Teoscar Hernandez, and of course Vladimir Guerrero Jr. behind him. So with that in mind, I think that Springer's not only going to be able to score a lot of runs, but also put up some productive numbers as well, since his projections over a full season was saying about a 40 home run season and over 100 RBIs for George Springer.
Yeah, I think you make a bunch of great points here. Springer's one of those guys where you can, as you mentioned before, check a lot of those boxes. You mentioned the runs, the RBIs, and the ability just to get on base with all of these other weapons that Toronto has surrounding him. So going into fantasy, he's one of those guys where you have a star-studded lineup around him, and he's able to generate those successful numbers that you want to see in a fantasy player.
And one other small plus is that you kind of want to keep in mind is if you're not able to get a lot of stolen base guys like your Starling Martes, your Adalberto Mondesi's, those guys that can steal 30 to 40 bases, a guy like Springer who can steal 15 is a perfect spot, especially when he hits average home runs and RBIs like you mentioned.
Yeah, you hit it on the nail there. So moving over to pitchers now, we'll take it over back to the NL, and that is Chris Bassett from the New York Mets. He was acquired in the offseason from the Oakland Athletics in the massive house cleaning that Oakland underwent. Bassett's someone where you understand his talent, you know what he's capable of moving into this season, but what makes his upside so special is the amount of opportunities that he's going to be getting in the start of the season. With Jacob deGrom now out indefinitely, you have some injury struggles with Max Scherzer, but he will be playing in this opening series. Regardless, Chris Bassett will get the opportunities. He's up there with talent Taijuan Walker, Kyle McGill, who's starting opening day this season, and then you have Carlos Carrasco as well. But Chris Bassett pretty much highlights the four pitchers there. 12-4 with a 3.15 ERA last season with Oakland. He's certainly going to be a guy you're going to want to look for whip. He had a 1.06 whip last season, and he's pretty high in strikeouts with 159 from 2021. So all around a solid pitcher. May not be the star that you're looking for. Like we mentioned, your DeGroms, your Chris Sale when he's back healthy, but he's certainly someone that can be a nice complement as your 3-4 pitcher.
Exactly. I think it's a really good pitcher to grab, especially if you go hitters really early in your draft. And the thing about Bassett is, and maybe my one concern with him, is that he's transferring from Oakland, who had a phenomenal defense on the infield with Matt Chapman and Matt Olson and Elvis Andrus as well, to a little bit of a more shoddy defense. Of course, Francisco Lindor at shortstop, no questions there. But Eduardo Escobar, Jeff McNeil, Robinson Cano, and Pete Alonso as the rest of the infield. For a guy who has a solid ground ball rate, you want to question how he's able to transition with the Mets infield. But like you mentioned, very low in the rankings, so he's able to really produce great numbers for a guy you can grab in the triple digits.
Yeah, and you made a great point, too. I think the defense is definitely going to be something that the Mets are going to want to watch for this season. You have a new manager in Buck Showalter, who with Baltimore was known to have a pretty strong and solidified defense, especially in the infield. So you're going to have to rely on more guys like Lindor, Pete Alonso, Jeff McNeil to really help the guys out like Bassett.
For sure. And we'll go from one guy who had a great ground ball rate to another guy, and this is one of my favorite pitchers, similar to what I thought of Corbin Burns last year before he made that big jump to an NL Cy Young, and that's Logan Webb of the San Francisco Giants. He's really going to be depended on as the ace of this staff, even though they brought in Carlos Rodon from the Chicago White Sox. They did lose Kevin Gausman, who was pretty much the anchor of the rotation the previous 2 years. So Logan Webb is going to be dependent on a lot. 11-3 record with just over a 3 ERA, a 1.1 whip this past season, and he was phenomenal down the stretch for the Giants. Put up 2 phenomenal starts against the Dodgers in the National League Division Series and was really good from August on for the Giants. He pretty much serves as a staff ace, even with Kevin Gausman over the last 2 months, and I think he's a really solid value for someone that I think has top 5 upside at the position. He can be drafted in around the 5th or 6th round, depending on the size of your leagues. I think he's just a phenomenal talent. I think that he has 15-win upside, a very good ERA ceiling, and, of course, like I mentioned with the whip, doing very solid there. So for a guy who, even though he doesn't have the immense strikeout numbers that you like to see from guys like DeGrom, Scherzer, Bieber, and some of the top guys in your fantasy starter rankings, I think Logan Webb is definitely going to outperform his ADP and potentially be even an NL Cy Young candidate this year.
Yeah, 100%. And I think the important thing to consider with Logan Webb is the age and the fact that he's now having a little more support despite losing Kevin Gausman. You brought in Carlos Rodon from the Chicago White Sox. You still have Anthony DeSclafani, who had some really hot points in the season last year, but also had some cold portions within 2021. So I think the support's there for the San Francisco Giants. But again, it's going to be Logan Webb that's going to be really dependent on this season. And considering the high ceiling that he has moving forward and the offense that the Giants produced last season, I think there's a lot of potential here in this kid.
For sure. So those are 4 players that we want you guys to keep your eyes out, not only in your fantasy baseball drafts, but in just the early months of the fantasy baseball season. That will wrap it up here for our last episode here of Fantasy Gods for the semester. We'll be back in the fall, but at least for now,
Keep calm, play fantasy.
See you next time.